Welcome back to part 3 of chapter 4. We will continue with the equilibrium in the money market. So, contractionary open market operation. The central bank sells bonds, which increases the supply of bonds in the bond market, which decreases the demand for bonds, decreasing the price of bonds. The decrease in bond prices increases the interest rate, and this money supply decreases and the interest rate increases and not decreases, so increases. This figure shows the simple supply and demand graph for contractionary open market operations. Equilibrium in money supply. Here we can see that money supply decreases from MS to MS prime, so it shifts MS to the left, and the interest rate increases from I to I prime, and the equilibrium moves from A to A prime. Does the central bank choose the money supply or the interest rate? So these go hand in hand. It is the same to say the central bank increases the money supply, which causes a decrease in the interest rate, or the central bank lowered the interest rate by increasing the money supply. What do banks do? Modern economies are characterized by the existence of many types of financial intermediaries. Financial intermediaries are institutions that receive funds from households and firms and use these funds to buy financial assets or make loans to other households or firms. The assets of these institutions are the financial assets they own and the loans they have made. Their liabilities are what they owe to other people and firms from who they have received funds. The focus here will be on banks who has deposits as their liabilities. So let's look at the balance sheet of a bank. So the assets, we have reserves, loans and bonds, and for the liabilities we have check deposits. So let's look at the liabilities, which is check deposits. Banks receive funds from people and firms who deposit funds. At any point in time, people and firms can withdraw up the full amount of the account balances. The liabilities of banks are therefore equal to the value of these deposits. Now let's look at the assets. Reserves. Banks keep as reserves some of the funds they receive. They are held partly in cash and partly at the reserve bank. Then we have loans. These loans are given to households and firms. And lastly, bonds. And here we speak about reserve bank bonds. Why do banks keep reserves? So banks hold reserves for 3 reasons. Number 1, there is no reason why inflows and outflows of deposits will be equal, so reserves offer buffer for this. Number 2, transfers can happen from one bank to another. And number 3, banks are subject to reserve requirements, which require them to hold reserves in some proportion of the check deposits. In South Africa, reserve requirements are set by the South African Reserve Bank, and the actual reserve ratio or reserve requirement is 2.5%. So banks need to keep 2.5% of their deposits, and they can loan the rest, which is 97.5%, to other households and firms. So run on the bank implies when many depositors withdraw their holdings. Reserve requirement. The Reserve Bank can increase or decrease the reserve requirement to influence the money supply as well. If they increase the reserve requirement, banks must hold more money in reserves to fulfill this requirement, and banks have less money to loan to households and firms. So an increase in the reserve requirement decreases the money supply. If they decrease the reserve requirement, banks can hold less money in reserves to fulfill this requirement, and banks have more money to loan to households and firms. So a decrease in the reserve requirement increases the money supply. Supply and demand for central bank money. The interest rate is determined by the supply and demand for central bank money. The demand for central bank money is equal to the money demanded by households and firms plus the reserves of commercial banks. The supply of central bank money is under the direct control of the central bank. The demand for money. When people hold both currency and check deposits, the demand for money involves two decisions. Number one, how much money do they want? And number two, how much currency will they hold and how much will they deposit? So overall, the demand for money is influenced by the transaction level and the interest rates on bonds. So the overall demand is given by the same equation as before, which we said MD is equal to RLI with a negative sign. Let's assume people hold a fixed proportion of their money in currency, and we call this proportion C, and by implication hold a fixed proportion 1 minus C in check deposits. Call the demand for currency CUD, where CU is for currency and the D for demand. Call the demand for check deposits D, so a capital letter D and a small letter d, the capital letter D for deposits and the D for demand. The two demands are then given by CUD is equal to CMD. This component shows the first component of the demand for central bank money, the demand for currency by the public, and the second equation, which is DD is equal to 1 minus CMD, shows the demand for check deposits. The demand for reserves. The larger the amount of check deposits, the larger the amount of reserves the bank must hold. Let theta be the reserve ratio, the amount of reserves banks hold per rand of check deposits. Let R denote the reserves of banks, and let D denote the rand amount of check deposits. Then by the definition of theta, the following holds between R and D. So R is equal to theta times D, or reserve requirement times deposits banks earn. The demand for reserves are given by RD is equal to theta times 1 minus CMD. The demand for central bank money. Call HD the demand for central bank money. This demand is equal to the sum of the demand for currency and the demand for reserves, and it is written as HD is equal to CUD plus RD. Replace CUD and RD by the expressions from earlier to get HD is equal to CMD plus theta 1 minus CMD, which is also equal to HD is equal to C plus theta 1 minus CMD. Finally, replace the overall demand for money ND by its expression to get HD. So HD is equal to C plus theta 1 minus C RYLI. The supply of central bank money. The supply of money is controlled by the central bank. Let H be the supply of central bank money. The equilibrium condition is that the supply of central bank money be equal to the demand for central bank money. So in equilibrium, H is equal to HD, which is equal to C plus theta 1 minus C RYLI.